Hey dreamers, tonight let me guide you into a world where thunder sleeps and ancient gods whisper. This is the quiet, forgotten story of Zeus, not the mighty ruler you think you know, but the fragile child who once hid in the shadows. What secret promise saved the infant Zeus from his father's fury? Who were the silent guardians that protected him in the dark? And what moment transformed a frightened child into the king of the sky? Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if these journeys bring you a little closer to rest. It's always a pleasure to see our community of listeners, so let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, let us travel back to the beginning of the gods' reign, to the time when Cronus ruled the Titans, that golden age when the world was young and full of terrible absolute certainties. Picture it. The realm of Olympus had not yet been built. The great temples and marble palaces did not yet exist. Instead, there was the Titanhold, a place where reality itself seemed uncertain, where the laws of nature bent to the will of those who held dominion over existence. This was before Zeus and his siblings claimed their thrones. This was before the great war between the Titans and the Olympians reshaped the cosmos entirely. Cronus stood at the apex of this power. A king among kings, a titan whose very presence made the earth tremble and the stars bow their light. He had seized his throne through the same ruthless ambition that had burned in his father Uranus before him. His grip on power was absolute, his rule unquestioned, and his confidence was as vast as the sky itself. But confidence, as we all know, is often just arrogance wearing a crown. And arrogance has a way of inviting the very catastrophe it fears most. The first whispers of trouble came not from without, but from within the sacred chambers of prophecy itself. You see, in those ancient times, fate was not a suggestion or a gentle nudge from destiny. It was a force as real and inevitable as gravity, as binding as the laws that held the planets in their eternal dance. Even the gods could not escape it entirely. Even Cronus, for all his divine authority, was subject to the ancient truths that governed existence itself. One day, as Cronus moved through his halls of power, those towering chambers carved from living stone and lit by the eternal flames of the cosmos, he received word that troubled him deeply. A prophecy had been spoken. These words had emerged from the sacred texts, whispered by the fates themselves, or perhaps spoken through an oracle who had gazed into the fabric of tomorrow. The exact source mattered less than the message itself, which was stark and unmistakable. One of his children would grow to overthrow him. Now, imagine that moment. Imagine being told with absolute certainty that the very act of having children would be the instrument of your own destruction. It's a particular kind of terror, isn't it? Not the terror of immediate danger, but the terror of inevitability. The prophecy was not a maybe or a possibility. It was written into the very structure of fate itself. And so Cronus faced a choice that countless tyrants have faced throughout history, a choice born entirely of fear and desperation. Honestly, if you were a god suddenly confronted with this prophecy, would you believe it was unavoidable, or would you try to fight against it? For me, I think I'd probably try to find a loophole, maybe consult another oracle, just to be absolutely sure I wasn't going insane. But Cronus, in his infinite wisdom, chose a different path entirely. A solution that was as elegant as it was unnecessarily complicated, a signature of divine project management. He made a decision that would reverberate through the ages and reshape the entire cosmos. He decided that he would simply prevent his children from being born. Or, more accurately, he would ensure that any children his wife Rhea might give birth to would never draw a first breath. He would not destroy them after birth. He would not exile them to distant lands. Instead, He would swallow them whole the moment they emerged from the womb, consuming them entirely as they were born, trapping them in the depths of his eternal belly where they could never grow, never challenge him, never fulfill that dreadful prophecy. It sounds insane when you say it out loud, which it is, but in the logic of the gods, where power is absolute and death is merely a suggestion, where the body itself can be shaped and reshaped by divine will, this seemed like a reasonable solution. This seemed like wisdom. This seemed like the only path forward to guarantee eternal rule. Rhea, Cronus's wife and queen of the Titans, did not share her husband's enthusiasm for this plan. She was no passive divine ornament waiting in the background. Rhea was a titaness in her own right, a goddess of abundance and fertility, a force of nature every bit as powerful as her husband, though her power took different forms. She was the mother of the gods, and in that role lay a fierceness that no mere prophecy could shake. She understood something that Cronus, in his terrible fear, had forgotten, that a mother's love could be stronger than any destiny, sharper than any fate, more cunning than any god's wisdom. When Cronus swallowed their first child, a son, Rhea felt the devastation like a wound across her very essence. She felt her child, alive but trapped, conscious but imprisoned within the darkness of his father's body. And she felt rage, pure, crystalline, righteous rage. But Rhea was wise enough to know that rage alone would not save her unborn children. What she needed was a plan. What she needed was cunning, and cunning, when wielded by a desperate mother, is perhaps the most dangerous weapon in all of existence. As the seasons turned and another pregnancy began to swell within her, Rhea began to think carefully about how she might outsmart her husband. This was a god, after all, one of the most powerful beings in the cosmos, a creature whose will had reshaped mountains and summoned storms. How could she, even as a titaness, hope to deceive him? The answer lay not in strength, but in cleverness. The answer lay in a stratagem so simple and yet so audacious that it bordered on brilliant. Rhea would go to her parents, to Gaia, the earth itself, and to Uranus, the sky that had come before Cronus, and she would seek their help. She would enlist allies in her desperate gamble to save her child. For even a king of the Titans can be outwitted if the conspiracy against him is well crafted enough, if the allies who stand against him are powerful enough, and if the moment of deception strikes at exactly the right instant. When the time came for her to give birth again, Rhea left the halls of the Titans and travelled to Crete, to a sacred place far removed from Cronus's immediate domain. This island held a particular significance in the ancient world. It was a place of magic and power, where the boundaries between the mortal and divine worlds grew thin and permeable. The very soil seemed to hum with ancient energy. The air tasted of salt and something indefinably sacred. Here, hidden in a cave deep within the heart of the island, surrounded by the sound of running water and the whisper of wind through ancient stone, Rhea gave birth to her son. This child was Zeus. This was the one who would one day fulfill the prophecy. This was the one who would reshape the entire cosmos. But on the day of his birth, in that sacred cave, he was simply an infant, vulnerable, innocent, and utterly dependent on his mother's ability to keep him alive and hidden from his father's consuming rage. The moment of his birth was filled with the overwhelming sensations that accompany all new life. There was pain and then relief. There was the cry of a newborn, a sound that pierced the ancient air of the cave like a small thunderbolt. There was the smell of birth and earth and something ineffably new. And there was fear. A bone-deep, primal fear in Rhea's heart that Cronus would somehow know, that he would sense his son's existence the way a predator senses the trembling of prey. But Rhea had not just sought refuge in a sacred place. She had brought something with her, something that would become the instrument of her deception. Her parents had given her a plan, a stratagem so cunning that even Cronus's divine intellect would not see through it until it was far too late. They had given her a stone a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes, bound like an infant, presented to all appearances like a newborn child. When Cronus demanded to see his newborn, when he came to Rhea with the hunger of a predator and the certainty of a tyrant who expected absolute obedience, Rhea handed him the stone. And Cronus, so consumed by his fear and his arrogance, so blinded by the confidence that he had already devised the perfect solution to the prophecy, swallowed it without hesitation. Can you imagine that moment? The sheer audacity of it? A goddess standing before the king of the Titans, handing him a rock and watching as he swallowed it, believing himself to have consumed his newest threat. The universe, in that instant, had pivoted on a point smaller than a grain of sand. Fate itself, which had seemed so inevitable, had been bent around a simple stone and a mother's desperate love. As Cronus swallowed the stone, satisfaction settled over him like a warm cloak. He felt the weight of it descending into his belly, and in that sensation he felt the assurance of his eternal rule. One more child prevented. One more threat neutralized. One more step toward a future where the prophecy could never come to pass. He could not see. None of us ever can. That this very act, this moment of what he believed to be triumph, was in fact the beginning of his own end. Cronus withdrew from the sacred cave, never suspecting the truth. The stone, so similar in weight and shape to an infant, had convinced him entirely. He had done exactly what he meant to do. He had consumed another of his children before they could grow strong enough to threaten him. The prophecy, he believed, was becoming increasingly impossible to fulfill. What could threaten him now? Meanwhile, in the depths of the cave, hidden beneath the care and protection of the Titaness Rhea and her divine parents, Zeus grew. The infant breathed the air of the sacred place. His small lungs filled with the scent of earth and water and ancient magic. The sound of the sacred spring echoed off the stone walls of his sanctuary, and all around him, though he was too young to understand, the gods who loved him and the Titans who feared him both felt the tremor of his arrival. A new force had entered the cosmos. A new power was growing in the darkness. And though no one yet knew it, the reign of Cronus had, in that moment, begun its slow journey toward its inevitable end. Rhea remained vigilant. She knew that one deception might hold Cronus at bay for a time, but that the king of the Titans would not remain fooled forever. She would need to protect her son carefully, keep him hidden completely, let him grow strong in the sacred darkness before the day when he would be ready to face his father. For now, though, Zeus was safe. For now, the prophecy, that terrible, inevitable prophecy, had been bent by a mother's love and a god's ambition. And in that bending, the first threads of the great war to come had begun to weave themselves into the fabric of fate. The cave held its secrets close. The stone walls seemed to absorb the sound of Zeus's first cries, swallowing them into silence before they could travel to Cronus's ears. The earth itself, through Gaia's ancient power, seemed to welcome this new divine child. And Rhea stood guard, knowing that she had bought time. Not victory, not safety, but time. And time, when you are facing inevitable fate, can be more valuable than any treasure in all the cosmos. Have you ever thought about what courage really means when you're facing something that seems completely inevitable? Do you think Rhea was brave for trying to fight the prophecy, even though she couldn't know if her plan would work? For me, I think there's something profoundly human about her struggle. The way she refused to accept what seemed like destiny. That refusal, that insistence that another path must exist, even when the universe says otherwise, that's where real power lies. But time, as anyone who has raised a child knows, is not a passive thing. Time demands action. Time requires care, vigilance, and an infrastructure of love that can sustain a life through its most vulnerable moments. And so, having deceived Cronus with a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes, having given birth in the hidden depths of a sacred cave on Crete, Rhea now faced a challenge, perhaps even more daunting than the deception itself. She had to ensure that her infant son would survive, grow strong, and remain hidden from the most powerful being in the cosmos. The cave where Zeus had been born was no ordinary place. It was located on Mount Ida, or perhaps Mount Dicta, depending on which ancient storyteller you trust, and it was saturated with the kind of magic that predated even the Titans themselves. This was a place where the boundaries between the mortal and divine worlds grew thin and permeable, where the very stones seemed to breathe with ancient consciousness, where water ran in sacred springs that had witnessed the birth of reality itself. The air inside tasted of minerals and moisture, of earth and something indefinably holy. Shadows moved in ways that suggested they were not merely the absence of light, but presences in their own right. Hera could not stay with her son. Her absence from the halls of the Titans would be noticed, would raise questions that even her divine status could not deflect forever. And so she did what countless mothers throughout history have done when circumstance demands it. She entrusted her child to others, to those who would love him and protect him as fiercely as she herself would. She called upon beings whose very nature was intertwined with care, with nurturing, with the patient work of raising a life from helpless infancy to powerful adulthood. Enter the nymphs, those ethereal beings who exist at the intersection of nature and divinity, who are neither fully mortal nor entirely divine, but something wonderfully in between. The sources differ on their names and their exact number, as ancient stories often do, but what remains constant across every telling is their dedication, their tenderness, their absolute commitment to the small, helpless godchild who had been placed in their care. Some accounts name them as Adrasteia and Ida, daughters of Melicius, a being whose name itself means honey or bee-man. These nymphs understood sweetness in all its forms, not merely the physical sweetness of honey and nectar, but the sweetness of care, of patience, of watching a small thing grow toward its potential. Other traditions speak of different nymphs, or of more than two, suggesting that Zeus's care was a collective effort, a community of divine feminine energy gathered around this singular, precious life. Can you imagine being entrusted with such a responsibility, knowing that the infant in your arms is destined to reshape the entire cosmos, that his survival or death will determine the fate of gods and mortals alike for all eternity? For me, I think the weight of it would be almost unbearable. And yet these nymphs accepted it without hesitation, without complaint. They simply did what needed to be done. Ca. The nymphs fed Zeus on a diet that was itself a kind of magic. There was milk, not the milk of any ordinary creature, but the milk of Amalthea, a being whose exact nature has been debated for millennia. Was Amalthea a nymph herself, a divine caretaker in humanoid form? Or was she a she-goat, a sacred animal whose milk carried within it the essence of divine nourishment? The ancient sources cannot quite agree, and perhaps that ambiguity is itself meaningful. Perhaps Amalthea was both, and neither, a being who could shift between forms as necessity demanded, who embodied the principle of maternal care rather than any single physical shape. What we know for certain is that her milk sustained Zeus. It flowed into his small body and became the foundation of his strength, the literal substance from which a god-king would be built. Have you ever thought about how the most powerful beings start from the most vulnerable positions? How even Zeus, who would one day command lightning and shake the foundations of reality with his voice, began as an infant who needed milk to survive. There's something profound in that, something that connects even the mightiest gods to the universal experience of dependence, of needing care, of being fundamentally vulnerable before we can become strong. But milk alone, however divine, was not the only sustenance the nymphs provided. They also fed Zeus honey, that golden substance that ancient peoples understood as something close to the food of the gods themselves. Honey does not spoil. Honey has been found in ancient tombs, still edible after thousands of years, as though it exists somehow outside of time's usual decay. In feeding Zeus honey, the nymphs were feeding him preservation, sweetness, the distilled essence of flowers and sunlight transformed by the miraculous alchemy of bees. Some stories speak of sacred bees within the cave itself, bees that served as nurses to the infant god, their buzzing a kind of lullaby, their honey offered directly from the comb. These were no ordinary insects, but creatures touched by the divine, understanding in their small, complex way that they were participating in something that would echo through all of subsequent history. The nymphs washed Zeus in the sacred springs that ran through the cave. They wrapped him in soft cloths. They sang to him in voices that blended with the sound of running water and the whisper of wind through stone chambers. They taught him, as he grew from infant to child, about the world beyond the cave, about stars and seasons, about the nature of growing things, about the stories that gods and mortals told. But even the most loving care could not guarantee safety. Even in his hidden sanctuary, Zeus was in constant danger. Cronus might discover the deception at any moment. He might sense, through whatever mysterious channels connect a father to his offspring, even across vast distances, that one of his children had escaped his devouring maw. He might hear, somehow, the cries of the infant god. And Zeus, being an infant, cried. He cried when he was hungry, he cried when he was uncomfortable. He cried for all the reasons that babies cry, because crying is how helpless beings communicate their needs to those who can meet them. But every cry was a risk. Every wail that echoed off the cave walls was a potential signal, a beacon that might guide Cronus to this hidden place and end the prophecy before it could begin. This is where the Curetus, or Curetus, depending on how you transliterate the Greek, entered the story. These were young warriors, divine beings whose exact origins are somewhat obscure, but whose purpose in this moment was crystal clear. They were Zeus's guardians, his protectors, the shield between the infant god and discovery. The Curetes devised a stratagem that was as clever as it was necessary. They positioned themselves around the cave, armed with bronze shields and spears, and whenever Zeus cried, they would dance. Not just any dance, but a fierce, martial dance, full of energy and noise and deliberate cacophony. They would strike their spears against their shields in a rhythmic clanging that filled the air with sound, that created a wall of noise so complete and so overwhelming that it drowned out the infant's cries entirely. Picture it, these young warriors, moving in synchronized patterns around the cave entrance, their bronze weapons flashing in whatever light filtered into that sacred space, the sound of metal on metal ringing out across the mountainside. To any observer it might look like a ritual, like a ceremony of worship or celebration, and in a sense it was both of those things. But it was also a deception, a necessary trick to keep the future king of the gods alive through his most vulnerable years. The Curetes danced for months. They danced for years. Every time Zeus's voice rose in hunger or discomfort or simple infant frustration, they raised their own voices in a counter-song of percussion and movement. They never failed in their duty. They never grew tired or careless. They understood, as the nymphs understood, that they were part of something larger than themselves, that their dance was literally holding the future of the cosmos in its rhythm. Chas, have you ever been responsible for keeping a secret that mattered more than anything else? Have you felt the weight of knowing that a single mistake, a single moment of inattention, could destroy everything? The Curetes lived with that weight constantly, and they bore it with the dedication of true guardians. There's another detail that some traditions include, one that speaks to the thoroughness of Zeus's concealment. His cradle was suspended from a tree, not placed on the ground, not set on a shelf carved into the cave wall, but hung between earth and sky in a kind of liminal space. The reasoning, according to these stories, was that Cronus's power extended across the earth, through the seas, and up into the heavens. But this in-between space, neither fully earth nor sky nor sea, this place where the cradle swayed gently in whatever breeze moved through the cave, was outside his immediate perception. It was a blind spot in the surveillance of a tyrant, and in that blind spot Zeus could exist safely. Can you imagine being that infant, suspended between worlds, rocked by unseen currents of air, surrounded by beings whose entire purpose was your survival? There's something both terrifying and beautiful about that image. Terrifying because of the precariousness of it, the way Zeus's entire existence hung by literal threads. Beautiful because of the care and ingenuity that went into creating that precarious safety. As months became years, Zeus grew. He grew in the way that divine children grow, which is to say, not quite like mortal infants, but with a speed and sureness that suggested his inherent power. His limbs lengthened and strengthened, his cries became words, his helplessness transformed gradually into capability. The nymphs taught him to walk on the uneven floor of the cave, steadying him when he stumbled, celebrating with him when he managed his first independent steps. They taught him to recognize the tastes of different honeys, to understand that each reflected the flowers from which it came. They taught him the names of things, the names of stones and water, of light and shadow, of the creatures that sometimes ventured near the cave. Amalthea, whether goat or nymph or something ineffably between, remained a constant presence, a source of nourishment and comfort. Some stories suggest that Zeus formed a bond with her that transcended the usual relationship between a child and his nurse, that he loved her with the fierce, uncomplicated love that children reserve for those who care for them in their earliest, most formative years. The curettes continued their dance, though as Zeus grew older and gained more control over his voice, as he learned to be quiet when necessary, their constant vigilance could relax somewhat. But they never abandoned their post entirely. They remained the outer circle of protection, the first line of defense against any threat that might approach the cave. Zeus learned about the world in pieces, in fragments. The cave was his universe, but it was not a small universe. The sacred space contained multitudes, chambers and passages, pools of water that reflected no light, places where the stones seemed to hum with ancient power. He explored these spaces with the fearless curiosity of a child who has never known true danger, whose understanding of threat is purely abstract. Male. But gradually, inevitably, questions began to form in his developing mind. Children always ask questions. It's how they make sense of the world, how they construct meaning from the sensory chaos that surrounds them. And Zeus was no exception. Why did he live in a cave when the nymphs spoke of a world beyond, a world of sky and sun and endless space? Why did the curettes dance with such fierce dedication? Why did Rhea visit only rarely, and why did her visits seem tinged with both joy and sorrow? The nymphs, wise in the way that caregivers often are, answered what they could and deflected what they couldn't. They told him stories of heroes and monsters, of the titans who ruled the cosmos, of the nature of divinity itself. They taught him without seeming to teach, shaping his understanding through narrative and example rather than direct instruction. Zeus grew into a child of unusual intensity. The sources describe him as possessing an inherent power even in youth, a charisma and strength that suggested his eventual destiny. He was clever, quick to learn, possessed of a mind that grasped patterns and connections with remarkable speed. He was also stubborn, willful, showing early signs of the authority he would one day wield. The nymphs loved him for all of it, for his brightness and his stubbornness, for his questions and his silences, for the way he would sometimes sit at the cave's entrance, though never venturing beyond it, and stare out at the world he could sense but not yet fully enter. As Zeus matured from child to youth, the nature of his education shifted. The nymphs began to speak more directly about the divine realm, about the complex relationships and ancient enmities that structured existence. They told him about power and responsibility, about the difference between authority and tyranny. They did not yet tell him the full truth of his own origin, of who his father was and what had been done to his siblings. That knowledge would come later, when he was ready to bear its weight. But they prepared him for it, laying groundwork of understanding about the nature of fear, about how terror can drive even gods to monstrous acts. The curates, too, contributed to his education. They taught him the arts of war, though at first only in play. They showed him how to hold a weapon, how to move with purpose and control. They told him stories of battles and strategies, of how conflicts between divine beings reshaped the fundamental structure of reality. Amalthea remained his comfort through all of it. When the education felt overwhelming, when the weight of things he didn't fully understand pressed too heavily, he could return to her and find the simple, uncomplicated reassurance of her presence. There were moments of pure joy in that hidden childhood, moments when the cave seemed not a prison, but a sanctuary filled with love. There were games played in the sacred pools, stories told by firelight, songs sung in harmonies that blended nymph voices with the natural acoustics of stone. There were lessons that felt like play, and play that contained profound lessons. Zeus learned patience in those years, though patience would never be his dominant characteristic. He learned loyalty by experiencing the absolute dedication of those who protected him. He learned that love could manifest as vigilance, as dedication, as the willingness to dance for years to keep a child safe. Mama. But even in that place of safety and care, even surrounded by beings who would have died to protect him, Zeus was being shaped by his hidden status. He was learning what it meant to be a secret, to exist in defiance of the power that wanted him not to exist at all. He was absorbing, at a level deeper than conscious thought, the reality that his very life was an act of rebellion. The cave that was his sanctuary was also his boundary. He could not leave it, could not venture out into the wider world that he sensed beyond its stone walls. And in that constraint, in that necessary limitation, the future king of the gods learned something about longing, about the desire for freedom, about the difference between safety and sovereignty. Do you think a childhood like that, hidden, protected, but also constrained, shapes a person differently than one lived in the open? For me, I think it must create a particular kind of hunger, a need to claim space and authority that was denied during those formative years. Zeus's later reign, his insistence on absolute sovereignty, his inability to tolerate any challenge to his power, perhaps it all traces back to these years when his existence itself was contingent on remaining hidden, on being small and quiet and contained. The years passed. Zeus grew from infant to child to youth to young man, though the timeline of divine childhood is not the same as mortal development. All the while, Cronus ruled in ignorance, believing he had successfully thwarted the prophecy, believing his throne was secure. The nymphs, the curates, and Amalthea had done their work well. They had kept Zeus alive. They had nurtured not just his body, but his mind and spirit. They had given him an education in love and loyalty, in strength and cleverness. They had prepared him without fully knowing what they were preparing him for. And in the depths of that cave on Crete, in the space between earth and sky and sea, in the care of beings whose names would echo through all subsequent mythology, the future king of the gods waited, grew stronger, and moved inexorably toward the moment when he would emerge from hiding and claim his destiny. The prophecy was still in motion. The dance of the curatus would not need to continue forever, and the time was approaching when Zeus would learn the full truth of who he was, why he had been hidden, and what terrible task awaited him. But time, as we've learned, does not stand still. Not for mortals, not for gods, and certainly not for secrets that cannot remain hidden forever. The years of Zeus's hidden childhood eventually gave way to something inevitable, something that had been building since the moment Rhea first deceived Cronus with a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes. The prophecy was still in motion. The dance of the curettes would not need to continue forever, and the time was approaching when Zeus would learn the full truth of who he was, why he had been hidden, and what terrible task awaited him. The moment of revelation came when Zeus had grown into full adulthood, though what constitutes adulthood for a god is perhaps different from mortal measurements. He had reached a point of physical maturity and mental readiness, a convergence of strength and understanding that suggested he was no longer the vulnerable infant who needed the curette's protective dance. The nymphs and guardians who had raised him knew that the time had come to tell him everything. Can you imagine what that conversation must have been like? Sitting in the cave that had been his entire world, surrounded by the beings who had loved and protected him since birth, learning for the first time that his father, the king of all the Titans, the ruler of the cosmos itself, had tried to devour him. Learning that he had siblings he'd never met, brothers and sisters who existed in a state of suspended animation within their father's belly. Learning that his very existence was an act of defiance against the most powerful being in creation. For me, I think the anger would be overwhelming, but perhaps Zeus felt something more complex than simple rage. Perhaps he felt a kind of destiny settling over him, a recognition that his hidden childhood had all been preparation for this moment, for the terrible and necessary task that lay ahead. The beings who had raised him did not simply tell him the story and expect him to act alone. They had been preparing for this moment as much as he had been growing toward it. They understood that defeating Cronus would require more than raw power or righteous anger. It would require strategy, allies, and most importantly, it would require help from someone with knowledge that Zeus did not yet possess. This is where Metis entered the story. Metis, the Oceanid, one of the Titans' own kind, a being whose name literally meant wisdom or cunning intelligence. She was not merely clever in the way that mortals understand cleverness, but embodied a kind of practical, strategic intelligence that could see around corners, that could find solutions to seemingly impossible problems. And she had decided, for reasons the myths do not fully explain, to align herself with Zeus rather than with the established order of Cronus's reign. Perhaps Metis saw in Zeus something that Cronus had lost, a potential for justice rather than mere tyranny, for leadership rather than fearful hoarding of power. Perhaps she simply understood, as some beings do, which way the currents of fate were flowing and chose to position herself accordingly. Whatever her motivations, her contribution to Zeus's cause would prove absolutely essential. Metis devised a plan that was as elegant as Rhea's earlier deception had been. She created an emetic, a substance designed to induce vomiting so powerful that even a Titan king could not resist its effects. But creating the substance was only half the challenge. The other half was getting Cronus to consume it. The exact mechanism of this varies depending on which ancient source you consult. Some suggest that Metis herself approached Cronus in disguise. Others imply that Zeus, having emerged from his hidden sanctuary, confronted his father directly and somehow forced the emetic upon him. Still others speak of trickery, of the substance being mixed into drink or food that Cronus consumed without suspicion. For what matters is the result. Cronus, that mighty Titan who had ruled the cosmos with absolute authority, who had believed himself to have permanently prevented the prophecy through his terrible solution of devouring his children, suddenly found himself convulsing, his divine body rejecting what it had consumed. And then he began to vomit. First came the stone, that magnetite rock that Rhea had wrapped in blankets so many years ago, the false Zeus that Cronus had swallowed in place of the real one. It emerged from his throat and fell to the ground, a monument to his deception and his failure. Zeus would later take that stone and place it at Pytho on Mount Parnassus, where it would stand as a memorial, a reminder of the moment when everything changed. But the stone was only the beginning. After it came Zeus's siblings, expelled from their father's body in reverse order of their consumption. They emerged fully grown, for they had not died within Cronus's belly, but had existed there in a kind of suspended state, aging and developing despite their imprisonment. Mama. First came Poseidon, god of the seas, already bearing the majesty and power that would make him master of all waters. Then Hades, lord of the underworld, whose realm would become the final destination of mortal souls. Then the goddesses, Hera, who would become queen of the gods, Demeter, goddess of the harvest and the growing earth, and Hestia, goddess of the hearth and home. Imagine witnessing that moment. Imagine watching 5 fully formed divine beings emerge from their father's throat, blinking in light they had never seen, breathing air they had never tasted, seeing for the first time the cosmos they had been denied. They had been conscious within Cronus's belly, aware but imprisoned, knowing they existed but unable to act. Now they were free. And they were angry. Zeus did not need to convince his siblings to join his cause. Their very liberation was sufficient reason for alliance. Cronus had stolen their lives, had denied them existence in the wider world, had made them prisoners for the crime of simply being born. Whatever complex emotions they might have felt toward their father, and the relationships between gods and their parents are never simple. Those emotions were overwhelmed by the reality of what had been done to them. But Zeus and his 5 siblings, however powerful, were not enough to challenge Cronus and the Titans. The Titans were the older generation of gods, beings who had ruled the cosmos since the overthrow of Uranus. They had power and experience that the newly freed Olympians lacked. A direct confrontation would be catastrophic, and its outcome far from certain. Zeus understood this. His hidden childhood had given him time to think, to plan, to understand that victory would require more than righteous cause. He needed allies, powerful allies who had their own reasons to hate Cronus, and who possessed capabilities that could tip the balance of divine warfare. He thought of the stories the nymphs had told him, the histories of the cosmos that he had learned in the sacred cave. He remembered hearing about beings who had been imprisoned long before his own siblings, beings who had suffered under Cronus's rule even longer than anyone else, and he knew where he needed to go. Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, the prison where the most dangerous and powerful beings were kept locked away from the light of the world above. It was there that Cronus had imprisoned 2 groups of beings after taking power from Uranus, beings whose freedom could change everything. The first group were the Cyclopes' 3 brothers, each possessed of a single eye in the centre of their forehead, beings of immense strength and unparalleled skill in craftsmanship. Their names were Bronte's thunder, Sterope's lightning, and Argy's brightness. They had been imprisoned by Uranus originally, briefly freed by Cronus when he overthrew his father, only to be imprisoned again once Cronus secured his own power. They had been trapped in the darkness of Tartarus ever since, their extraordinary talents unused, their potential wasted. The second group were even more formidable, the Hecatonches, the 100-handed ones. There were 3 of them, Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges. Each possessed 100 hands and 50 heads, forms so alien and powerful that they inspired fear even in other gods. They too had been imprisoned first by Uranus and then, after a brief taste of freedom, by Cronus. These beings had every reason to hate Cronus. They had been denied their freedom, locked in eternal darkness, treated as dangers rather than as the powerful allies they could be. If Zeus could free them, if he could offer them not just liberation but a place in the new order he envisioned, they might become the decisive advantage in the coming war. But reaching them would not be simple. Tartarus was guarded. Cronus had placed a warden to ensure that his prisoners remained imprisoned, a creature whose very nature was designed to prevent escape. Her name was Campe, a she-monster whose form combined the most terrifying aspects of multiple creatures. She was as much a force of confinement as she was a living being, a manifestation of the principle that some things must remain locked away. Zeus made the descent into Tartarus. How he found the entrance, how he navigated the darkness of that terrible place, the myths do not fully detail. What they do tell us is that he confronted Campe directly, that he fought her with the strength and skill he had developed during his hidden years, and that he slew her. The guard fell, and the prison doors stood open. Have you ever thought about what courage means in the context of gods? Zeus could be injured, could be overpowered, could potentially even be killed under the right circumstances. This was not a being who was immune to consequences, but rather one who chose to face terrible danger because the alternative, leaving things as they were, was unacceptable. When Zeus freed the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires, he did not simply break their chains and demand their service. He spoke to them about his vision for a different kind of rule, about the possibility of a cosmos where power was not hoarded through fear and imprisonment, but shared among allies who respected one another. He offered them not just freedom, but dignity, not just liberation, but purpose. The Cyclopes responded first. These master craftsmen, finally free to practice their extraordinary skills after years of enforced idleness, immediately set to work creating weapons worthy of the war to come. For Zeus, they forged thunderbolts, not mere lightning in the natural sense, but concentrated divine power that could be wielded as weapons, capable of shattering mountains and shaking the foundations of reality itself. These thunderbolts would become Zeus's signature weapon, the symbol of his power that would be recognized throughout all subsequent mythology. But the Cyclopes did not stop with Zeus alone. For Poseidon they crafted a trident, a three-pronged spear that would give him command over the seas, the ability to raise storms and earthquakes to make the waters obey his will. For Hades they created the helmet of darkness, a piece of armor that rendered its wearer invisible, allowing the god of the underworld to move unseen even by other divine beings. These were not merely weapons. They were symbols of the new divine order that Zeus envisioned, tools that would define the roles and domains of the gods who wielded them. The Hecatoncheires pledged their support in a different way. Their contribution would not be craftsmanship but direct combat. With their 100 hands each, they could hurl boulders and missiles with a speed and volume that no other being could match. They would be living siege engines, capable of overwhelming any defense through sheer relentless assault. With these allies secured, Zeus's coalition began to take shape. He had his 5 siblings, each powerful in their own right. He had the Cyclopes, providing weapons and strategic advantage. He had the Hecatoncheires, offering overwhelming force, and he had Metis, whose counsel and cunning intelligence continued to guide his strategic thinking. But Zeus understood something that many leaders throughout history have failed to grasp: the legitimacy of his cause mattered. It was not enough to have power. He needed to present his rebellion as something more than merely one generation of gods overthrowing another in an endless cycle of patricide. He needed to offer a vision that other gods could believe in, could choose to support. And so Zeus made a declaration. He established his base of operations on Mount Olympus, that sacred peak that rose above the mortal world, and from there he called upon all the gods of the cosmos to make a choice. He did not demand allegiance or threaten punishment for those who refused. Instead, he made a promise. Any god who chose to align with him against Cronus would preserve their honors and domains under his rule, and any god who currently had no honors would receive them. This was revolutionary thinking. Cronus had ruled through fear and suppression, through imprisonment of those who might threaten him. Zeus was offering something different, a meritocracy of sorts, a system where loyalty would be rewarded and capabilities recognized. Some gods responded to his call immediately. Themis, the titaness of divine law and order, understood that Zeus represented a better future than Cronus's fearful tyranny. She brought not just her own support, but her understanding of cosmic justice, her ability to see and interpret the will of fate itself. Prometheus, whose name meant forethought, also sided with Zeus. This titan possessed the ability to see into the future, to understand the likely outcomes of choices before they were made. His support meant that Zeus had access to strategic foresight, to the ability to plan not just for the immediate conflict, but for the long aftermath that would follow. Other gods chose differently. Many titans, loyal to Cronus through bonds of kingship or fear or simple inertia, refused Zeus's offer. They would stand with the old order, believing either in its righteousness or in its inevitable victory. The cosmos was dividing along lines of allegiance. On one side stood Cronus and the titans who supported him, the old guard, the established order, beings who had ruled since the overthrow of Uranus. On the other side stood Zeus and his coalition, the Olympians, the freed prisoners of Tartarus, and those gods who believed that change was both necessary and possible. The stage was set for the Titanomachy, the war between Titans and Olympians, the conflict that would reshape the entire cosmos and determine who would rule over gods and mortals alike. But before the war could truly begin, before the first blow could be struck, there was a moment of preparation, of gathering forces and steeling resolve. Zeus looked upon his allies and felt, perhaps, a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in what he had accomplished, having gone from a hidden infant to the leader of a divine rebellion. Anger at what Cronus had done, not just to him but to his siblings and to all those who had suffered under tyrannical rule. And perhaps also fear because, despite his allies and his weapons, despite the righteousness of his cause, victory was far from certain. Cronus stood at the head of the Titans with his own considerable power and the weight of established rule. He had been king of the gods for an age, had shaped the cosmos according to his will. His fall would not come easily. The weapons were forged, the alliances were made, the armies were assembled on their respective sides. And somewhere in the space between Olympus and the realm of the Titans, in that charged atmosphere where divine wills prepared to clash, the future of existence itself hung in balance. Zeus gripped his thunderbolt, that masterwork of Cyclope's craftsmanship, that weapon that represented both his power and his purpose. His siblings stood ready, each armed and prepared, each carrying their own reasons for fighting. The hecatoncheires flexed their 100 hands, preparing to unleash a barrage of stone and force that would shake the heavens. Anger. And Cronus, understanding finally that the prophecy he had tried so desperately to prevent was now rushing toward its fulfillment, prepared to defend his throne with all the terrible power at his command. The moment before war is always strange, isn't it? That pause where everyone knows what's coming, but it hasn't quite begun yet, where the weight of inevitability presses down, but action hasn't yet been taken. for Zeus, standing at the head of his assembled forces, having journeyed from hidden infancy to this moment of cosmic rebellion, that pause must have felt both endless and impossibly brief. Everything he had learned in the cave, every story the nymphs had told him, every moment of the curator's protective dance, every drop of Amalthea's milk, and every taste of sacred honey, it had all been leading to this. The hidden childhood was over. The time for secrecy and protection had passed. Now was the moment for action, for war, for the violent birthing of a new order from the death of the old. The Titanomachy was about to begin, and with it, the cosmos itself would be reborn. The Titanomachy ensued, lasting an entire decade. This period was marked by intense clashes between the Titans and the Olympian gods. 10 years, a span of time that seems almost incomprehensible when you're talking about divine beings who experience existence so differently from mortals. But perhaps that's exactly the point. Perhaps the length of the war tells us something profound about how evenly matched these two forces actually were, about how the outcome was never as certain as we might assume from our position of knowing how it all turned out. The battlefield was vast beyond mortal comprehension. On one side stood Mount Olympus, that sacred peak rising above the mortal world, newly claimed by Zeus and his allies as their stronghold. On the other stood Mount Othrys in Thessaly, the ancient seat of Titan power where Cronus had ruled since overthrowing his own father. Between these two divine mountains stretched the plains of Thessaly, some 5,000 square miles of territory that would become the primary theatre for a conflict that would literally reshape the cosmos. Can you imagine standing on that plain and watching gods prepare for war? The air itself must have felt different, charged with the kind of tension that precedes thunderstorms, except magnified to a scale where the entire atmosphere seemed to hold its breath. The earth trembled in anticipation, understanding perhaps better than anyone what was about to unfold upon its surface. Zeus had positioned himself brilliantly. Mount Olympus gave him the advantage of height, allowing his forces to strike down upon the Titans from above. The Hecaton chairs, those 100-handed giants he had freed from Tartarus, could launch devastating volleys of stone across distances of 30 kilometers or more, their multiple arms creating a barrage that seemed endless. The Cyclopes continuously replenished Zeus's arsenal of thunderbolts, ensuring a relentless supply of the most devastating weapons ever created. But the Titans were not helpless. They were the older generation of gods, beings who had shaped the cosmos before the Olympians were even born. They possessed immense power and the confidence that comes from ages of unchallenged rule. Cronus himself stood at their head, the Titan king who had overthrown his own father and believed, perhaps until the very moment Zeus forced him to vomit up his children, that he had successfully prevented the prophecy that threatened his reign. The first clash was heralded not by trumpets, but by the groaning of the earth itself. Zeus, having freed the monstrous Hecaton chairs from their Tartarian prison, unleashed their fury. These giants, each with 100 mighty arms, hurled mountains, not mere boulders but entire mountain ranges, at the Titan ranks. The air became a storm of stone, a relentless barrage that blotted out the sun and shadowed the Titans beneath an apocalypse of earth and rock. Picture it. The sky darkening not with clouds but with fragments of mountains, with stones the size of buildings flying through the air in such numbers that they formed a solid mass. The sound alone must have been unbearable. The whistling of displaced air, the impact of stone on divine armor, the crashing of rocks against the slopes of Mount Othrys creating landslides that added to the chaos. The earth fractured and groaned under the impact, volcanoes erupting as the very land buckled beneath forces it was never designed to withstand. Simultaneously, the Cyclopes presented their gifts to the Olympian forces. To Zeus, they gave the thunderbolt, not just one, but a continuous supply of weapons of unimaginable power. Ancient sources paint a picture of blinding flashes and deafening roars as Zeus unleashed the raw power of the storm. The air itself crackled with heat, forests igniting into infernos, and the smoke of burning earth shrouded the heavens. Zeus hurled so many lightning bolts that the mountain belched steam, and smoke rose as the forest erupted into flame. For Poseidon, the Cyclopes crafted a trident, a three-pronged spear that gave him command over the seas and the earth itself. When Poseidon struck the ground with his trident, earthquakes rippled across the battlefield, collapsing the underground passages beneath Mount Othrys and burying Titan forces in avalanches of stone and soil. The seas themselves rose at his command, waters boiling with divine fury. Hades received the Helmet of Darkness, an artifact that rendered its wearer invisible even to other gods. Cloaked in invisibility, Hades moved like a phantom through the chaos. He was not a frontline warrior, but a master of subterfuge. He sowed discord among the Titan ranks, sabotaged their supplies, struck down their commanders unseen and unexpected. A version of the war's end speaks of Hades entering the very camp of the Titans upon Mount Othrys while invisible, destroying their weapons and armaments, and thereby ending the Titans' ability to continue fighting. Do you ever wonder what it's like to fight an enemy you cannot see? The psychological warfare alone must have been devastating. Every unexplained loss, every commander who fell without visible cause, every supply cache that mysteriously caught fire, all of it eroded Titan morale, planting fear deeper than any physical wound. Gry. The battles raged day after day, year after year. The Thessalian plain between the two divine mountains became a landscape of apocalyptic devastation, craters marked where Zeus's thunderbolts had struck with enough force to vaporize stone. Fields of broken boulders showed where the Hecatoncheir's barrage had landed. The very topology of the region was rewritten by divine warfare, valleys created by earthquakes, mountains reduced to rubble. Both sides proved evenly matched for years. The Titans possessed raw power and experience, the weight of their established rule, giving them a kind of legitimacy that the upstart Olympians lacked. But Zeus had allies whose capabilities were specifically designed to counter Titan advantages. Not all Titans fought for Cronus. Themis, the Titaness of divine law and order, understood that Zeus represented a better future than Cronus's fearful tyranny. She brought not just her own support, but her understanding of cosmic justice, her ability to see and interpret the will of fate itself. Prometheus, whose name meant forethought, also sided with Zeus. His ability to see into the future, to understand the likely outcomes of choices before they were made, gave Zeus access to strategic foresight that proved invaluable. The goddess Styx also aided Zeus, and her support carried particular significance. She brought her children, Nike victory, Kratos strength, Zelos rivalry, and Bia force to fight on the Olympian side. Nike herself was said to guide Zeus's chariot as he threw down his lightning bolts, her very presence ensuring that his attacks found their mark. But the majority of Titans remained loyal to Cronus. Atlas, in particular, emerged as a formidable military commander, leading the Titan forces with skill and determination. His strategic thinking kept the Titan army organized even under the relentless assault from Olympus. For years, his leadership helped the Titans hold their ground despite facing weapons and allies they had never anticipated. The war transformed the natural world into a nightmare of divine destruction. Ancient accounts describe the earth crashing loudly and the sea ringing out terribly. The tumult was so mighty that it shook the halls deep in Tartarus itself, that prison far below the surface of the world. The sky creaked and groaned under the strain of powers it was never meant to contain. Imagine being a mortal living anywhere near Thessaly during those 10 years. The constant thunder of battle, the earthquakes that never seemed to stop, the way the sun would be blocked out for days by smoke and ash and hurled mountains. The way water boiled in streams and rivers from the heat of divine conflict, the way the very air seemed to burn with energies beyond mortal comprehension. As the war dragged on, both sides sought advantages wherever they could find them. The Titans attempted to strengthen their ranks, calling upon every ally they possessed. Zeus responded by ensuring that his weapons never ran short, that the Cyclopes continued their tireless work forging thunderbolts, that the Hecatoncheires never ceased their barrage. The region's natural volcanic and seismic activity became weaponized under Olympian control. Poseidon triggered earthquakes that collapsed Othrys's underground passages, while eruptions at nearby volcanic sites buried Titan reinforcements under ash and lava flows. The battlefield itself became a weapon, reshaped by divine will into a landscape hostile to Cronus's forces. For me, there's something terrifying about the idea of a war that lasts a decade, where both sides possess the power to reshape reality itself. No ceasefires, no negotiations, just continuous combat for 10 years straight. What does that do to the combatants, even if they're gods? What kind of exhaustion must have set in? What kind of desperation as year followed year with no clear victor emerging? The final battle, according to ancient accounts, was the most spectacular event in the entire 10-year conflict. This was the moment when everything that had been building finally reached its crescendo, when the accumulated fury of a decade of warfare concentrated into a single, apocalyptic confrontation. Zeus was said to be unstoppable at this point. Guided by Nike from his chariot, he threw down his lightning bolts with devastating precision. One such bolt struck Menoetius, a Titan warrior, sending him screaming into the depths of Tartarus. The earth itself seemed to respond to the intensity of the conflict, trembling so violently that even the immortal gods felt uncertain of their footing. T. Hesiod reported that the tumult shook halls deep in Tartarus. Think about what that means. A prison carved into the deepest foundations of the world, protected by layers of rock and divine will, and the battle above was so intense that even there, in that place of ultimate confinement, the walls shook and trembled. The thunderbolts allowed Zeus to project power on a cosmic scale. During what some sources call the Siege of Mount Othrys, his lightning storms incinerated Titan encampments and triggered volcanic eruptions. Ancient texts describe how Zeus's bolts blasted the mountain, igniting forests and belching steam, while smoke shrouded the heavens. The volleys of lightning shattered Cronus's defenses, breaking through fortifications that had stood for ages. The many of Apollo's arrows fell throughout the battle as well, adding to the rain of divine projectiles that filled the air. Poseidon's trident shook the earth with each strike, creating fissures and chasms that swallowed Titan forces whole. The combined assault from multiple directions, from above, from within, from the very ground beneath their feet, proved too much for even the mighty Titans to withstand. And then, after 10 years of continuous warfare, after countless battles and skirmishes, after the landscape had been reshaped and the cosmos itself had been shaken to its foundations, Zeus and the Olympians emerged triumphant. The Titans were defeated, their army broken, their will to fight finally exhausted. But victory in war is only half the story. The question of what to do with the defeated is often more important than the victory itself. Zeus faced a choice that would define his rule and set the tone for the entire Olympian age. Yeah, he could have shown mercy. He could have allowed the Titans to retain some measure of dignity, some place in the new order he was establishing. But Zeus chose a different path, one that echoed Cronus's own treatment of those who might threaten his rule. Zeus had the defeated Titans imprisoned in Tartarus, that same pit where Cronus had once locked away the Cyclopes and Hecaton chairs. The irony was not lost on anyone. The very beings Zeus had freed from that prison now became its guards, the Hecaton chairs standing watch over the Titans to ensure they would never escape. Have you ever thought about what it means to imprison gods? Not kill them, because apparently that's either impossible or at least incredibly difficult, but to lock them away in eternal darkness, conscious and aware but utterly powerless. It's a particular kind of cruelty, isn't it? A punishment that stretches forward into infinity with no hope of parole, no possibility of redemption. Some Titans received special punishments. Atlas, who had led the Titan army with such skill and determination, was given a unique fate. He was condemned to hold up the sky itself, to bear the weight of the celestial spheres on his shoulders for all eternity. Every moment of every day, forever, Atlas would feel that impossible weight pressing down upon him, a living monument to the price of backing the wrong side in a divine war. There was also Arche, a messenger goddess who had served the Titans during the war. Zeus punished her defection by stripping her of her wings and casting her into Tartarus. Without her wings, that which had defined her very nature, she joined the other defeated Titans in their eternal imprisonment. Only Themis and Prometheus, those Titans who had sided with Zeus from the beginning, retained their freedom and their honors. They stood as proof that loyalty to the new order would be rewarded, that Zeus's rule was not merely revenge, but the establishment of a different kind of cosmos. Cronus's fate remained somewhat ambiguous in the ancient sources. Hesiod claims eternal imprisonment in Tartarus, the Titan king locked away with his defeated allies, stripped of power and authority, able to do nothing but contemplate his failure to prevent the very prophecy he had worked so hard to avoid. But later traditions suggest something different, that eventually, when Zeus became secure in his power, he relented and gave Cronus a kind of freedom. These accounts place Cronus as ruler of Elysium, or the Isles of the Blessed, governing over the honoured dead in a realm far from Olympus. This duality reflects evolving attitudes towards cyclical time and the possibility of redemption, even for tyrants. Key. With the Titans defeated and imprisoned, Zeus turned his attention to organizing the cosmos under the new order. He met with his brothers Poseidon and Hades, and together they divided the universe by drawing lots. Zeus won and became the king of the sky, as well as the ruler of mortals and gods. Poseidon became the ruler of the seas, his trident giving him dominion over all waters and the power to shake the earth with earthquakes. Hades, who drew the shortest straw, became the ruler of the underworld, the god who would oversee the realm of the dead and ensure that mortal souls reached their proper destinations. This division established the fundamental structure of the Greek cosmos that would persist throughout classical mythology. Three brothers, each supreme in their own domain, yet acknowledging Zeus as the ultimate authority. It was a power-sharing arrangement born from warfare, shaped by the understanding that victory had required cooperation and that the new age would need that cooperation to continue. This was the dawn of a new era in Greek mythology. The age of the Titans was over, ended by violence and imprisonment. The age of the Olympians had begun, founded on the rubble of the old order, built with thunderbolts and earthquakes and the bodies of defeated enemies. Zeus stood at the apex of this new cosmos, the king of the gods, wielder of the thunderbolt, the one who had journeyed from hidden infancy in a Cretan cave to absolute sovereignty over the divine realm. Everything the nymphs had taught him, every moment of preparation during his secret childhood, every risk he had taken in freeing the Cyclopes and Hecaton chairs, it had all led to this moment of triumph. But triumph in mythology is never simple. Victory carries seeds of future conflict. The Titanomachy's legacy of rebellion and retribution would persist, manifesting in subsequent conflicts like the Gigantomachy, when the giants would rise against the Olympians just as the Olympians had risen against the Titans. The cycle of overthrow that had claimed Uranus and then Cronus did not end with Zeus's victory. It merely paused, waiting for the next generation to question the authority of their elders. For now, though, Zeus reigned supreme from his throne on Olympus. The thunderbolts of the Cyclopes remained at his disposal, ready to strike down any who might challenge his authority. The Hecatoncheires stood guard over Tartarus, ensuring that the imprisoned Titans could never escape to threaten the new order. And the cosmos itself, reshaped by 10 years of divine warfare, settled into a new configuration under Olympian rule. The Titanomachy was over. The 10-year war that had shaken the foundations of existence, that had turned the plains of Thessaly into an apocalyptic wasteland, that had proven the prophecy that Cronus had tried so desperately to prevent, it was finished. Zeus had won. The hidden child had become the king of the gods, and nothing in the cosmos would ever be quite the same. The dust had settled, though settling is perhaps too gentle a word for what happened after the Titanomachy. The cosmos itself had been traumatized by 10 years of divine warfare, its very structure reshaped by forces that had never been unleashed with such intensity. Mountains had been reduced to rubble, valleys carved by earthquakes, the earth itself bearing permanent scars from battles between beings who could literally move mountains. The Titans were imprisoned in Tartarus, guarded by the very beings they had once imprisoned, and Zeus stood at the pinnacle of divine power, the hidden child who had become the king of gods. But victory is only the beginning. Anyone who has ever won anything significant knows that the real work starts after the triumph, when you have to figure out what to do with what you've won. Zeus faced a challenge that was in some ways more daunting than the war itself. He had to organize the entire cosmos, establish an order that would prevent the kind of chaos that had just consumed a decade of existence, and do it in a way that satisfied the various powers who had helped him achieve victory. The first and most critical task was the division of the cosmos itself. Zeus had 2 brothers who had fought alongside him, who had emerged from Cronus's belly with their own considerable powers and their own legitimate claims to authority. Poseidon, with his trident forged by the Cyclopes, commanded forces of nature as potent as Zeus's thunderbolts. Hades, with his helmet of darkness, possessed abilities and knowledge that made him formidable in his own right. These were not subordinates to be commanded, but equals to be negotiated with. According to Homer's account in the Iliad, the 3 brothers drew lots to determine who would rule what. This detail is fascinating when you think about it. 3 of the most powerful beings in existence, fresh from victory in a cosmic war, deciding the structure of reality through what amounts to divine chance. Not through combat or negotiation or any demonstration of superior power, but through the drawing of lots, through an acceptance that fate itself would determine the division. Zeus drew the sky. The heavens became his domain, the realm of clouds and storms, of thunder and lightning, of the upper air where eagles soar and the weather is born. It was fitting, perhaps, the god who wielded thunderbolts ruling over the element that produced thunder. From the sky he could look down upon all that existed below, could see the entire cosmos spread out beneath him. Poseidon received the sea. All waters fell under his command, not just the oceans, but rivers and streams, lakes and springs, every drop of moisture that flowed across the surface of the world. His trident gave him the power to raise storms and calm waters, to cause earthquakes that originated in the depths of the ocean, to make the very earth tremble from his domain beneath the waves. Hades drew what many considered the shortest straw, the underworld. He became lord of the dead, ruler over the realm where mortal souls journeyed after death. His domain was Tartarus and the lands above it, the entire subterranean world that existed beneath the surface realm of the living. Some might see this as the least desirable portion, But Hades's realm came with its own form of power dominion over the one destination that awaited every mortal being, authority over the final transition that none could escape. The earth itself and Mount Olympus remained common ground, shared among all three brothers and indeed among all the gods. This was crucial. It meant there was neutral territory, places where the gods could gather without any single power, claiming exclusive dominion. Mount Olympus, in particular, became the seat of divine government, the place where Zeus would establish his court, and where the assembled gods would make decisions about the fate of mortals and immortals alike. Have you ever thought about how different this division was from Cronus's reign? Cronus had ruled alone, hoarding power, imprisoning potential threats, operating from a place of fear and paranoia. Zeus created something different, a power-sharing arrangement, a recognition that the cosmos was too vast and complex for any single being to rule every aspect of it. It was government by coalition, authority distributed rather than concentrated. But Zeus was still supreme. His brothers ruled their own domains with considerable autonomy, but Zeus was acknowledged as the king of gods and men, the ultimate authority to whom even Poseidon and Hades deferred on matters that affected the cosmos as a whole. This supremacy was not merely symbolic. Zeus possessed the thunderbolt, that weapon forged by the Cyclopes that could strike down gods as easily as mortals. He had proven in war that he could command loyalty and coordinate diverse forces toward a common goal, and he had the legitimacy that comes from having fulfilled a prophecy, from being the one who had finally broken the cycle of sons overthrowing fathers, or at least paused it. The double with the major division of power established, Zeus turned his attention to organizing Mount Olympus itself. This sacred mountain would become the center of divine civilization, the place where the new order would be most visibly manifest. He began the process of building what would become the legendary palace complex, the halls and chambers where gods would dwell and conduct the business of managing existence. But physical structures alone do not make a government. Zeus needed to distribute honors and responsibilities among all the gods who had supported him, to create a system where every divine being had a defined role and domain. According to Hesiod, this distribution was done on the advice of Gaia, the earth itself, who counseled Zeus to accept unanimous rule while apportioning powers and functions to each god. Zeus gave Demeter, his sister, and one of those freed from Cronus's belly, dominion over agriculture and the harvest. She would govern the growing of crops, the fertility of the earth, the cycle of planting and reaping that sustained mortal life. This was no small responsibility. In a world where most humans lived as farmers, where famine could devastate entire populations, the goddess who controlled the harvest held enormous power. To Hera, another of his sisters, Zeus granted authority over marriage and the family. She became the goddess who presided over domestic life, who blessed marriages and protected women in childbirth. In time, Zeus would make Hera his wife, his queen, the goddess who sat beside his throne and shared in his sovereignty. This marriage was political as much as personal. It united two powerful divine beings and created a kind of divine monarchy with Zeus and Hera as the king and queen of heaven. Hestia, the third sister, received the domain of the hearth and home. She became the goddess of the fire at the center of every household, the sacred flame that represented family continuity and domestic peace. Though her role might seem modest compared to some others, it was fundamental. Every home in the ancient world had a hearth, and every hearth was Hestia's shrine. For the gods who had allied with him, Zeus also distributed honors. Themis, the Titaness who had sided with him against Cronus, became his high counselor, seated beside his throne. She was the goddess of divine law and order, the one who understood the deep structures of justice that should govern both gods and mortals. Her 6 daughters, the Moirai, or Fates, and the Horai, or Seasons, were given responsibility for the orderly functioning of the cosmos. The fates controlled the threads of destiny, determining the lifespan and fortune of every being, mortal and immortal alike. The seasons regulated the passage of time, ensuring that the natural cycles of growth and decay, warmth and cold, continued their eternal patterns. Themis was also charged with summoning the gods to assembly in the courtyard of Zeus. This made her essentially the administrator of divine government, the one who organized the meetings where major decisions would be made. Her presence at Zeus's side signaled something important about his rule, that it would be based on law rather than mere force, on order rather than chaos. Prometheus, the other Titan who had supported Zeus, retained his freedom and his position of honor. His ability to see into the future, his gift of forethought, made him a valuable advisor, though this relationship would become complicated in future stories when Prometheus's sympathy for mortals would bring him into conflict with Zeus's will. The Cyclopes remained free and honored for their role in forging the weapons that had won the war. They continued their work as divine craftsmen, creating wonders for the Olympian gods. The Hecaton chairs were given the critical task of guarding Tartarus, ensuring that the imprisoned Titans could never escape. This was both an honor and a recognition of their unique capabilities. Who better to guard the most dangerous prisoners in existence than beings with 100 hands each? Zeus also established himself as the god of justice and hospitality. He became the protector of Xenia, the sacred bond between host and guest that was fundamental to ancient Greek society. Violation of hospitality became one of the offenses most likely to attract Zeus's wrath. He would strike down those who abused guests or hosts, who broke the sacred trust that made civilization possible. This role as guardian of social order extended Zeus's authority beyond the divine realm into the everyday lives of mortals. As god of justice, Zeus became the ultimate arbiter of disputes among both gods and mortals. He established the principle that law should govern behavior, that there should be consequences for wrongdoing, that power should be constrained by principles of fairness. This was revolutionary in a world where might had so often made right, where the strong simply took what they wanted from the weak. For me, there's something fascinating about Zeus taking on these roles after having grown up hidden and hunted, after having experienced powerlessness during his childhood in the cave. Perhaps that experience gave him insight into the need for law, for protection of the vulnerable, for systems that would prevent the kind of tyranny his father had exercised. The establishment of divine law extended to the regulation of interactions between gods and mortals. Zeus decreed that gods should not interfere too directly in mortal affairs without reason, that there should be boundaries between the divine and human realms. At the same time, he established that gods could father children with mortals, creating the race of heroes who would populate so many Greek myths. These demigods, half divine and half mortal, would serve as a bridge between the two realms, embodying both human limitation and divine potential. Zeus organized regular assemblies of the gods on Mount Olympus. These were not merely social gatherings, but legislative sessions, where the divine community would debate and decide on matters of cosmic importance. Themis would summon the gods at Zeus's command, and they would gather in the great courtyard to discuss their concerns, to air grievances, to make collective decisions about how to handle various situations. This created a kind of divine democracy, or at least an oligarchy. Zeus had final authority, but he consulted with the other gods and generally tried to build consensus. The establishment of this system meant that Zeus's rule was fundamentally different from Cronus's paranoid isolation. Where Cronus had hoarded power and trusted no one, Zeus distributed authority and created institutions. Where Cronus had ruled through fear, Zeus attempted to rule through law and shared governance. It wasn't perfect. Zeus's rule would have its own problems, its own injustices, its own moments of tyranny, but it represented a step toward a more organized, more stable cosmic order. Zeus also had to manage his own household, his own family relationships. He married Hera, making her queen of the gods and his official consort. But Zeus's romantic life was notoriously complicated. He would have numerous affairs with goddesses and mortal women, fathering children who would become major figures in mythology. Hera's jealousy of these affairs and her persecution of Zeus's lovers and illegitimate children would become a recurring theme in Greek myths. This aspect of Zeus's character seems contradictory, doesn't it? The god who established laws about marriage and family, who made his sister Hera the goddess of domestic fidelity, was himself the most notorious adulterer in mythology. Perhaps this reflects something the ancient Greeks understood about power, that those who make the rules often feel exempt from following them, that authority and restraint don't always go together. Have you ever noticed how the gods who rule over human virtues are often terrible at practicing those virtues themselves? Zeus demanded justice from mortals while behaving unjustly. Hera presided over faithful marriage while married to the most unfaithful husband imaginable. The gods were not moral exemplars, but rather beings of immense power, whose behavior reflected both human tendencies magnified to cosmic scale and the ancient Greek understanding that divinity and morality were separate categories. Zeus established festivals and forms of worship that would honor the gods. The Olympic Games, held every 4 years, became the most famous of these, a competition of athletic excellence dedicated to Zeus, where mortals from across the Greek world would gather to compete and to honor the king of the gods. Major temples were built at sites like Olympia, becoming centers of pilgrimage and worship. These physical and ritual structures helped integrate the new divine order into mortal life, making Zeus's supremacy not just a matter of cosmic organization, but a lived reality for human worshippers. The organization of Olympus extended to the creation of divine roles and responsibilities that would persist throughout classical mythology. Apollo would become god of music, poetry, and prophecy. Artemis would govern the hunt and wild places. Athena, who would later emerge from Zeus's own head in one of mythology's strangest births, would become goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare. Aphrodite would rule over love and desire. Ares would embody the brutal aspects of war. Hermes would serve as messenger and guide. Hephaestus would be the divine craftsman, forging weapons and wonders for the gods. Each of these deities received specific domains and honors, creating a divine bureaucracy where responsibilities were clearly defined. This specialization meant that mortals knew which god to pray to for which needs. Sailors would honor Poseidon, farmers would make offerings to Demeter, those in love would seek Aphrodite's blessing. The cosmos became organized not just at the top level of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, but all the way down through layers of divine authority and responsibility. Zeus also had to deal with the aftermath of the war in practical terms. The Thessalian plain, where much of the fighting had occurred, was left devastated, its topology permanently altered. The earth itself needed time to recover from 10 years of divine combat. Zeus had to establish peace, to signal that the time of war was over and the time of building had begun. The stone that Cronus had swallowed, the one Rhea had given him in place of the infant Zeus, was set up at Delphi. There it would stand as a monument, a sign thenceforth and a marvel to mortal men. This stone became a kind of sacred relic, a physical reminder of the deception that had saved Zeus and ultimately led to the overthrow of the Titans. Pilgrims would come to see it, to touch the stone that had once resided in a Titan's belly, to marvel at how something so simple had played such a crucial role in reshaping the cosmos. The new order Zeus established was not static. It would evolve and develop as new challenges arose, as relationships between gods shifted, as the balance of power adjusted to accommodate changing circumstances. But the fundamental structure, the division of the cosmos among the three brothers, The distribution of honors and domains among the gods, the establishment of law and assembly as governing principles, would persist. Zeus reigned from his throne on Olympus, wielding his thunderbolt, surrounded by his divine family and council. He had journeyed from a hidden infant to refugee child to revolutionary leader to king of gods. The prophecy that Cronus had tried so desperately to prevent had been fulfilled. The son had overthrown the father, just as Cronus had overthrown Uranus before him. But Zeus was determined that the cycle would end with him. He had learned from Cronus's mistakes, had seen how fear and paranoia led to tyranny and ultimately to overthrow. His rule would be different, more open, more consultative, governed by law rather than mere force. Whether this would be enough to break the cycle, whether Zeus's reign would prove more stable than his father's, remained to be seen. The cosmos had a new order. The age of the Titans was over. The age of the Olympians had fully begun. And from his throne in the sky, Zeus looked out over all that he had won, all that he now ruled, and prepared to face whatever challenges the future would bring. But the establishment of a new order is never the end of the story. Power, once seized, must be defended. Authority, once claimed, will be challenged. Zeus had defeated the Titans, had organized the cosmos, had distributed domains and honors among the gods. But the very act of overthrowing Cronus had set a precedent, had shown that the established order could be toppled by those with sufficient strength and determination. And there were beings in the cosmos who watched Zeus's rise with resentment, who saw in the new Olympian regime not justice, but usurpation, who waited for their moment to strike. The first great challenge came from the giants, or gigantes as they were known in Greek. These were not the hecatoncheires, those hundred-handed beings who had fought for Zeus and now guarded Tartarus. The giants were something different, a race born from the blood of Uranus when Cronus had castrated his father, the same violent birth that had produced the Furies. They were children of Gaia, the earth itself, and they possessed size and strength that made them formidable opponents even for gods. The giants had existed during the Titanomachy, but they had not intervened in that conflict. Perhaps they were waiting to see which side would emerge victorious. Perhaps they understood that the time was not yet right for their own bid for power. But when the war ended and Zeus imprisoned the defeated Titans in Tartarus, Gaia felt rage. Her children, first Uranus, then Cronus, had been overthrown. Her Titan offspring were locked away in eternal darkness. The new order that Zeus was establishing had no place for the primordial forces she represented. And so Gaia incited the giants to rebel. She urged them to challenge the Olympian gods, to overthrow Zeus just as Zeus had overthrown Cronus, to reclaim what she believed belonged to her children. The giants responded to their mother's call. They began to gather their forces, to prepare for war against Mount Olympus. The war that followed became known as the Gigantomachy, the Battle of the Giants. According to some sources, it began when a giant named Alcyonius stole the cattle of Helios, the sun god. This act of defiance, this casual theft of divine property, was both an insult and a declaration of intent. The giants were signaling that they did not recognize the authority of the Olympian gods, that they believed themselves entitled to take what they wished. But Zeus had learned from the Titanomachy. He understood that divine warfare required more than raw power. Before the giants could fully organize their assault, Zeus consulted prophecies and oracles. What he learned was troubling. The giants could not be killed by gods alone. A prophecy declared that only with the help of a mortal could the Olympians defeat these earth-born enemies. 2. This presented a unique problem. Gods were immortal, possessed of powers that mortals could barely comprehend. How could a mere human make the difference in a battle between divine forces? But prophecy in Greek mythology was absolute. If the prophecy said a mortal was necessary, then a mortal would be necessary. Fortunately, Zeus had a solution. He had a son, Heracles, born of his union with the mortal woman Alcmene. Heracles was a demigod, half divine and half mortal, possessed of superhuman strength and courage. He was exactly the kind of warrior who could fulfill the prophecy, while also having the power to actually contribute to divine combat. Zeus had Athena summon Heracles to aid the gods. The hero responded to the call, armed with his bow and arrows that had been dipped in the poisonous blood of the Hydra, a monster he had slain as one of his famous labors. These arrows were lethal even to beings with supernatural resilience. Meanwhile, Gaia attempted to protect her giant children. She searched for a magical herb that would make them invulnerable, that would shield them from any harm the gods might try to inflict. But Zeus was too clever for her. He commanded Eos, dawn, Selene, moon, and Helios, sun, to stop shining, plunging the world into darkness. In that darkness, Zeus himself searched for the herb, and he found it before Gaia could. He took every single plant for himself, denying the giants the protection their mother had tried to provide. Have you ever thought about what it means for the sun and moon to stop shining at a god's command? The sheer scale of power that represents? The ability to turn off celestial bodies, to plunge the entire world into darkness just to search for a plant? It's a reminder that Zeus's authority extended over fundamental forces of nature, that his will could reshape the basic conditions of existence. The battle itself was epic in scale, though perhaps not quite as prolonged as the 10-year Titanomachy. The giants attacked with tremendous fury, hurling mountains and boulders at the gods, shaking the earth with their footsteps. Their size and strength made them fearsome opponents, their connection to Gaia giving them power drawn directly from the earth itself. Zeus met them with thunderbolts, those weapons forged by the Cyclopes that had proven so devastating during the Titanomachy. Lightning strikes rained down upon the giants, but they proved remarkably resilient. This was where Heracles became crucial. After Zeus would strike a giant with his thunderbolt, weakening or stunning them, Heracles would follow up with his poisoned arrows, delivering the fatal blow that a god alone could not. The first giant to fall was Alcyoneus, the one who had stolen Helios's cattle. Heracles fought him directly, but discovered something disturbing. The giant could not be killed as long as he stood on his homeland, the region of Pallene. Alcyoneus was essentially immortal within his own territory. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, advised Heracles on what to do. The hero dragged Alcyoneus beyond the borders of Pallene, pulling him away from the soil that gave him invulnerability. Once outside his homeland, the giant could be killed, and Heracles struck him down with an arrow dipped in hydra venom. Other giants met similar fates. Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy, killed Eurytus. Athena herself entered the battle, burying the giant Enceladus under the entire island of Sicily, trapping him beneath a landmass so massive that even his tremendous strength could not free him. The other Olympians each took their turns, Apollo, Poseidon, Hephaestus, Artemis engaging the giants in combat and emerging victorious. Hermes killed Hippolytus, and the pattern repeated across the battlefield. Zeus's lightning would strike, Heracles' arrows would follow, and the giants would fall one by one. The combined might of gods and the crucial mortal hero proved too much for even these earthborn titans. The Gigantomachy represented something symbolically important beyond the simple fact of military victory. It was a battle between order and chaos, between the rationalism and civilization represented by the Olympian gods and the primal, untamed forces embodied by the giants. The giants were associated with earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, natural catastrophes, the violent, destructive aspects of nature that civilization constantly struggles against. Their defeat symbolized the triumph of divine order over these chaotic forces. For Zeus personally, the Titanomachy was proof that his new order could withstand serious challenge. The Titans had been the previous generation of gods, and their defeat could perhaps be explained by Zeus having allies and weapons they hadn't anticipated. But the giants were something different, beings specifically raised by Gaia to overthrow the Olympians. Their defeat demonstrated that Zeus's rule was not merely a temporary upset, but a stable, new reality. The defeated giants were punished according to various traditions. Some sources claim they were imprisoned in Tartarus alongside the Titans, that deepest pit becoming ever more crowded with the enemies Zeus had vanquished. Other accounts suggest they were transformed into stone, becoming mountains and geological formations that would stand forever as reminders of their defeat. Still others say they were simply slain, their souls condemned to the underworld where they would face eternal punishment. But Gaia's rage was not satisfied. Her children had been defeated again, locked away or destroyed by this upstart god who kept overthrowing the natural order. And so she conceived one final challenge to Zeus's authority, one final attempt to bring down the Olympian regime. She mated with Tartarus itself, that primordial pit, that fundamental darkness at the root of existence. From this union was born Typhon, perhaps the most terrifying monster Greek mythology ever produced. Descriptions of Typhon vary across sources, but all agree on his fundamental horror. He was gigantic, reaching to the stars themselves. He had 100 dragon heads, each breathing fire, each speaking in voices that ranged from divine speech to the bellowing of bulls to the roaring of lions. His body was covered with wings, and from his eyes flashed fire. He was storm and chaos and destruction given physical form, a living embodiment of everything that civilization and order stood against. Typhon rose against the gods, and for the first time since establishing his reign, Zeus faced something that truly threatened to overthrow him. The other gods fled in terror. Some sources say they transformed into animals and hid in Egypt. Only Zeus stood firm, wielding his thunderbolts against this ultimate monster. The battle between Zeus and Typhon shook the entire cosmos. Thunderbolts and dragonfire clashed in the sky. The earth trembled under Typhon's weight. Mountains were thrown, landscapes reshaped, the very fabric of reality strained under the conflict between these two titanic powers. For a time, the outcome was uncertain. Some accounts suggest that Typhon actually managed to overcome Zeus temporarily, cutting the sinews from his hands and feet and hiding them, leaving the king of gods helpless. In these versions, Hermes and Pan managed to retrieve the sinews and restore Zeus's strength, allowing him to continue the fight. But ultimately, Zeus prevailed. He struck Typhon with thunderbolt after thunderbolt, weakening the monster, driving him back. Finally, Zeus managed to trap Typhon beneath Mount Etna in Sicily, imprisoning him under the volcanic mountain. There, Typhon remained, and the volcanic eruptions of Etna were said to be the monster's breath, his continued rage against the imprisonment Zeus had imposed. With Typhon's defeat, the last serious challenge to Zeus's authority had been overcome. The king of gods had proven that he could defend his throne against the Titans, against the giants, and even against a monster born specifically to destroy him. His power was absolute, his position secure. But challenges to Zeus's authority came not only from external enemies. Internal conflicts among the gods themselves tested his leadership and his ability to maintain order on Olympus. The most significant of these involved his wife Hera and the various affairs Zeus conducted with both goddesses and mortal women. Hera's jealousy became legendary. Each time Zeus took a lover, each time he fathered a child outside their marriage, Hera would exact revenge. not typically on Zeus himself, for he was too powerful to challenge directly, but on his lovers and illegitimate children. She persecuted Leto, mother of Apollo and Artemis, preventing her from finding a place to give birth. She drove Heracles mad, causing him to kill his own wife and children, which led to his famous labors as penance. She plotted against countless others who had the misfortune to attract Zeus's attention. These domestic conflicts created tension on Olympus, fractured the divine community into factions, and required Zeus to constantly navigate between maintaining his authority and managing his complicated family relationships. It was a different kind of challenge than military threats from giants or monsters, but no less real. There were also moments when the gods conspired against Zeus directly. In one story, Hera, Poseidon, and Athena bound Zeus while he slept, attempting to overthrow him. Only the intervention of the sea nymph, Thetis, who summoned the Hecatoncheires to free Zeus, saved him from this rebellion. Zeus punished the conspirators, hanging Hera from the sky with golden chains, threatening Poseidon and Apollo with exile. The incident demonstrated that even among the Olympians themselves, Zeus's authority was not simply accepted, but had to be maintained through a combination of power, cunning, and the cultivation of loyal allies. These conflicts and challenges, both external and internal, served to consolidate Zeus's power rather than weaken it. Each victory proved his legitimacy, demonstrated his capability, showed that he could defend the order he had established. The Titanomachy confirmed that the Olympian regime could withstand assault from beings specifically created to overthrow it. Typhon's defeat showed that even the most terrifying individual opponent could not match Zeus's power. And the management of internal conflicts demonstrated Zeus's political skill, his ability to maintain authority even among beings who were nearly his equals. By surviving these challenges, Zeus transformed from a revolutionary who had overthrown his father into a legitimate king whose rule was accepted as the natural order of things. The hidden child in the Cretan cave, the young god who had freed his siblings and sparked a war, that figure had become something else entirely. Zeus was now the established authority, the defender of cosmic order, the king whose throne had been tested and found unshakable. Sigh. The cosmos settled into a new stability. The Titans were locked in Tartarus, the giants defeated, Typhon trapped beneath Mount Etna. The gods of Olympus performed their assigned roles, managed their domains, and acknowledged Zeus's supremacy. Mortals built temples and offered sacrifices, integrating the Olympian gods into the fabric of their civilizations. Zeus's reign would continue for all subsequent Greek mythology, an era of relative order compared to the chaos that had preceded it. There would be other conflicts, other challenges, other moments when his authority was questioned. But the fundamental structure he had established, the division of the cosmos, the organization of divine responsibilities, the system of law and assembly, would persist. The King of Gods had proven he could not only seize power but hold it, could not only win wars but govern in peace, could not only overthrow the old order but create a new one stable enough to last. From hidden childhood to ultimate sovereignty, from secret infant to eternal king, Zeus's journey was complete. Zeus's reign was not merely about governance and warfare, about establishing cosmic order and defending it from external threats. It was also profoundly personal, shaped by relationships that would define Greek mythology for all time. The king of the gods had an appetite, some might say an insatiable hunger, for romantic and sexual conquest that led him to pursue goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women alike. These relationships, consensual and otherwise, produced offspring who would become some of the most important figures in Greek mythology, heroes and gods whose stories would be told for thousands of years. Before his marriage to Hera, Zeus had several consorts who held legitimate positions as his wives. The first, and perhaps most important, was Metis, a titaness whose name literally meant wisdom or cunning intelligence. She had been the one who devised the plan to free Zeus's siblings from Cronus's belly, who had created the emetic that forced the Titan king to vomit up his children. Zeus married her, recognizing both her value as an ally and her extraordinary mental capabilities. But then prophecy intervened, as it so often did in Zeus's life. He learned that Metis would bear a daughter, and after that, a son who would overthrow him. Zeus had fulfilled the prophecy about overthrowing his own father, breaking the cycle, or so he thought. Now he learned that the cycle might continue, that his own child might do to him what he had done to Cronus. His solution was both cunning and horrifying. When Metis became pregnant, Zeus tricked her into transforming into something small, a fly, according to some accounts, and then swallowed her whole. He literally consumed his first wife and their unborn child, incorporating her wisdom into himself. It was an act that echoed Cronus's devouring of his children, the very tyranny Zeus had fought against. The cycle had not been broken after all, merely transformed. But Metis was not destroyed. Inside Zeus she continued to exist, continued to counsel him from within. And their daughter continued to develop, growing not in a womb, but inside Zeus's own head. Eventually Zeus developed a terrible headache, a pain so intense that even a god could not bear it. Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, split Zeus's skull open with an axe. From that wound emerged Athena, fully grown and fully armed, a goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare who became one of Zeus's most valued children. Had you ever thought about how strange this birth story is? Athena, the goddess of wisdom, born from her father's head with no mother present, or rather, with a mother absorbed into the father's being. It's mythology's way of describing Zeus claiming credit for wisdom itself, incorporating the feminine principle of intelligence into masculine authority. Athena would become Zeus's favorite child, the one who sat closest to his throne, who wore his aegis into battle. Zeus's second wife was Themis, the titaness of divine law and order, who had sided with him during the Titanomachy. Their marriage produced the Horai, the seasons, who regulated the passage of time and the cycles of growth, and the Moirai, the three fates who controlled the threads of destiny. These were not merely children, but fundamental forces of cosmic order, beings whose existence helped structure reality itself. His third wife was Mnemosyne, goddess of memory. For 9 consecutive nights Zeus lay with her, and from these unions came the 9 muses, Calliope, Clio, Erato, Euterpe, Melpomene, Polyhymnia, Terpsichore, Thalia, and Urania. These goddesses would preside over the arts and sciences, inspiring poets, historians, musicians, and astronomers. Every work of human creativity that invoked the muses was thus acknowledging Zeus as their grandfather, their ultimate source. Then came Leto, a titaness who would bear Zeus twin children of extraordinary importance, Apollo and Artemis. Their birth was complicated by Hera's jealousy, for by this time Zeus had married his sister and made her queen of the gods. Hera, learning of Leto's pregnancy, forbade any land to offer the Titan a sanctuary for giving birth. Leto wandered desperately, seeking a place to deliver her children, until she finally found Delos, a floating island that was not technically land, and thus not bound by Hera's decree. Apollo was born first, and would become god of music, poetry, prophecy, and healing, a figure of such cultural importance that his oracle at Delphi would shape Greek history. Artemis came second, becoming goddess of the hunt, of wild places, of childbirth and young women. Both would be among the most powerful and respected Olympian deities. Only after these consorts did Zeus marry Hera, making her his final and official wife. According to some accounts, their courtship began during the Titanomachy itself, when they would sneak away from the war to be together in secret. Zeus, knowing Hera's love of animals, transformed himself into a bedraggled cuckoo bird. When Hera took the poor creature into her arms to warm it, Zeus revealed his true form and seduced her. Ashamed, whether of being tricked or of having been intimate before marriage, Hera agreed to marry him. Their marriage produced Ares, god of war, Hebe, goddess of youth, and Eileithyia, goddess of childbirth. Some sources also include Hephaestus as their son, though other traditions claim Hera bore him alone as a response to Zeus's solo production of Athena. Regardless of their children's origins, the marriage between Zeus and Hera became legendary for its dysfunction. Hera was a faithful wife who presided over marriage and family, while Zeus was notoriously unfaithful, pursuing countless lovers throughout their union. For me, there's something almost tragic about Hera's position. She was queen of the gods, one of the most powerful beings in existence, yet her mythology is dominated by her response to her husband's infidelities. She couldn't punish Zeus directly, he was too powerful, so she directed her rage at his lovers and illegitimate children. It was a pattern that would play out again and again, creating some of mythology's most poignant stories. Zeus's affairs after his marriage to Hera were numerous. He pursued Europa, a Phoenician princess, by transforming himself into a beautiful white bull. When Europa climbed onto the bull's back, entranced by its gentleness, Zeus swam across the sea to Crete, that same island where he had been born and hidden as an infant. There he revealed himself and made love to her. Europa bore him 3 sons, including Minos, who would become king of Crete and, after death, one of the judges of the underworld. He pursued Io, an Argive priestess, and to hide his affair from Hera, he covered the world in thick clouds. When Hera grew suspicious and descended from Olympus, Zeus transformed Io into a white heifer. Hera, not fooled, asked for the heifer as a gift, and set Argus Panoptes, a giant with 100 eyes, to guard her. Zeus sent Hermes to kill Argus and free Io, but Hera then sent a gadfly to torment her, driving the transformed woman on a maddened journey across the world. He pursued Danae, a princess whose father had locked her in a bronze chamber after learning that her son would kill him. Zeus came to her as a shower of gold, penetrating the chamber and impregnating her. The child born from this union was Perseus, who would become one of Greece's greatest heroes, slayer of Medusa and rescuer of Andromeda. He pursued Semele, a Theban princess, and promised to grant her any wish. Hera, disguised as Semele's nurse, convinced the princess to ask Zeus to appear before her in his true divine form. Zeus, bound by his promise, revealed himself in all his glory, and the sight of him in his full divine majesty, accompanied by his lightning and thunder, incinerated Semele instantly. But Zeus rescued their unborn child from her womb, sewing the infant into his own thigh, where it could finish developing. This child was Dionysus, who would become god of wine, ecstasy, and theatre. A deity who blurred boundaries between civilization and wildness, sanity and madness. Key. He pursued Leda, queen of Sparta, coming to her in the form of a swan. From this union came Egg's mythology at its strangest, from which hatched Helen, whose beauty would launch 1,000 ships and cause the Trojan War, and Polydeuces, one of the famous Dioscuri twins. He pursued Alcmene, wife of Amphitryon, by taking her husband's form while the real Amphitryon was away at war. Zeus even made one night last as long as 3 to extend his time with her. The child born from this deception was Heracles, the greatest of all Greek heroes. Heracles would perform 12 impossible labours, would fight alongside the gods in the Gigantomachy, and would eventually be granted immortality and a place on Olympus. Zeus's transformations during these pursuits became a recurring pattern. He became a bull for Europa, a swan for Leda, a shower of gold for Danae, an eagle for Ganymede, a satyr for Antiope, even the goddess Artemis herself to deceive Callisto, a virgin huntress sworn to the goddess. These shape-shiftings served multiple purposes. They helped him approach his targets without suspicion, they allowed him to evade Hera's watchful eyes, and they perhaps also spoke to something about the nature of divine power, about how gods could inhabit any form they chose. But we must acknowledge the troubling nature of many of these encounters. Many of Zeus's relationships involved deception, coercion, or outright force. Ancient sources often gloss over this with euphemistic language. Zeus loved her, Zeus lay with her, but the power dynamics were profoundly unequal. A god approaching a mortal woman was not a relationship between equals. The consequences for the women were often devastating: social ostracism, Hera's vengeful persecution, death in childbirth, or through divine punishment. The children born from these unions became central figures in Greek mythology. Perseus slew Medusa and founded Mycenae. Heracles performed labours that became archetypal hero stories. Helen's face launched the Trojan War, reshaping the Greek world. The Dioscuri became protectors of sailors and warriors. Minos gave Crete its laws and its legendary labyrinths. Among the divine offspring, each claimed a domain and developed a mythology of their own. Apollo established his oracle at Delphi, became patron of music and poetry, represented rational enlightenment. Artemis roamed wild places with her huntresses, protected women in childbirth, embodied fierce independence. Dionysus brought wine and ecstasy, disrupting social order, teaching mortals to transcend their limitations through ritual madness. Hermes became messenger of the gods, guide of souls to the underworld, patron of travelers and thieves. Athena, born from Zeus's head, became goddess of wisdom, strategic warfare, and crafts. She was Zeus's favorite, the one he trusted most, the one who could wield his aegis, that shield bearing Medusa's head in battle. She represented the intellectual aspect of warfare, planning, and strategy rather than Ares's brutal bloodlust. Cities honored her, and Athens itself bore her name. Number 4. These children extended Zeus's influence across every aspect of Greek life. There was no domain without a child of Zeus presiding over it, no major myth without a Zeus-born hero at its center. Through his offspring, Zeus's presence permeated Greek mythology so completely that it became almost impossible to tell a story without invoking his lineage. The pattern of Zeus's relationships also established precedents that would echo through mythology. Gods pursuing mortals became a common theme, creating the race of demigods who would populate heroic legends. The jealous wife punishing the other woman rather than her unfaithful husband became another recurring motif, embodied most perfectly in Hera. The transformation of gods into animals or objects to accomplish their purposes became a standard divine ability. Zeus's countless affairs also created a vast web of relationships that connected different mythological cycles. Perseus's story connected to Heracles' story through their shared father. The Trojan War involved multiple children of Zeus: Helen, whose beauty caused the conflict, the Dioscuri, who had been her brothers, various heroes who fought in the war and could trace their lineage back to the king of gods. Apollo and Artemis's myths intertwined with countless others. Dionysus's journey across the Greek world brought him into contact with nearly every other mythological figure. The sheer number of Zeus's children became a kind of running commentary on his character. Ancient sources list dozens of offspring, and likely many more existed in local traditions that didn't survive into recorded mythology. Each city, each region might claim a hero or minor deity descended from Zeus, each wanting a connection to the king of gods. For Hera, each new child was a fresh wound, a new reminder of her husband's infidelity. Her persecution of Zeus's illegitimate offspring became so severe that it shaped the lives of heroes like Heracles, whose famous labours were imposed as punishment after Hera drove him temporarily mad. Yet she remained married to Zeus, remained queen of the gods, trapped in a relationship that brought her constant pain. Do you think the ancient Greeks saw Zeus's behaviour as admirable or problematic? The sources suggest a complex view. Zeus was clearly the king of gods, the ultimate authority, but his treatment of his lovers and his wife was often portrayed as causing suffering and chaos. Perhaps this reflected an understanding that power and virtue don't always coincide, that those who rule are not necessarily moral exemplars. Through his relationships and offspring, Zeus shaped not just Greek mythology but Greek culture itself. The heroes he fathered became models of excellence, however flawed. The gods he produced governed every aspect of life. His presence in so many bloodlines meant that nobility could claim descent from him, that kings could justify their rule through divine ancestry. From the hidden infant in a Cretan cave to the king whose children populated the cosmos, Zeus's journey had created a mythology that would define Western culture for millennia. His relationships, however troubled, had given the Greek world its most important stories. His offspring, both divine and mortal, carried forward his legacy in every myth they inhabited. With the great conflicts resolved, with his offspring populating the cosmos and his authority tested and proven, Zeus settled into a role that would define Greek mythology for all time. He became not merely a warrior king who had seized power through revolution, but something more fundamental, the overseer of cosmic order itself, the guarantor of justice, the eternal ruler whose gaze stretched from the heights of Olympus to the deepest concerns of mortal life. His transformation from hidden infant to supreme authority was complete, and now the work of maintaining that supremacy would occupy him for all eternity. One nigh. Zeus's primary epithet became far-seeing. Homer used it constantly in his epics, a recognition that the king of gods possessed vision that extended beyond immediate circumstances, that could perceive patterns and consequences invisible to others. This was not merely physical sight, though Zeus could indeed see across vast distances from his throne on Olympus. It was a deeper kind of perception, the ability to understand the true nature of things, to recognize potential and character, to play what modern strategists might call the long game. This far-seeing wisdom allowed Zeus to make decisions that transcended simple self-interest. When Hermes, the trickster god born of Zeus's union with the nymph Maia, disrupted the established order by stealing Apollo's cattle while still an infant, Zeus could have simply punished him. Instead, he saw something valuable in Hermes's cleverness, understood that there was a place for disruption and change within cosmic order. He made Hermes one of the Olympians, gave him a role as divine messenger and guide of souls, turned potential chaos into structured purpose. Zeus became the upholder of a just order. This was his primary responsibility and the source of his legitimate authority. He watched over the doings and sufferings of mortals, ensuring that wrongs were avenged and crimes punished. He protected suppliants, those who came seeking help or sanctuary. He was the guardian of hospitality, that sacred bond between host and guest that was fundamental to Greek civilization. He presided over oaths, ensuring that promises made under his name would be kept or face divine retribution. The worst villains of myth faced Zeus's particular wrath. Tantalus, who stole ambrosia from heaven and served his own son as food to the gods in a grotesque test of their omniscience, was condemned to eternal punishment in Tartarus, standing in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree, with the water receding whenever he bent to drink and the fruit pulling away whenever he reached to eat. Lycaon, who served human flesh to Zeus to test whether the god could distinguish it from animal meat, was transformed into a wolf, condemned to embody the bestial nature he had displayed. Ixion, who attempted to seduce Hera, was bound to a burning wheel that spun eternally through the sky. Salmoneus, who tried to imitate Zeus's thunder and steal worship that belonged to the gods, was struck down by an actual thunderbolt. These punishments were not arbitrary acts of divine pique. They represented Zeus's role as enforcer of cosmic propriety, as the power that maintained boundaries between mortal and divine, that ensured proper respect for the gods and proper behavior among humans. Zeus was creating and maintaining a moral order, establishing through his judgments what was acceptable and what would be punished. Yet Zeus's relationship with fate itself was complex and sometimes contradictory. The Moirai, the three fates named Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, were in most traditions Zeus's own daughters, born of his union with Themis, the titaness of divine law and justice. They wove the threads of destiny for every being, determining the length of each life and the manner of each death. Clotho spun the thread, Lachesis measured its length, and Atropos cut it at the appointed time. No one could change fate, not even Zeus. When his beloved son Sarpedon was destined to die in battle during the Trojan War, Zeus knew it in advance but could not prevent it. He could only watch as the mortal he cherished met the end that had been determined for him. In another scene, Zeus held a pair of scales weighing the fates of Hector and Achilles, measuring their destinies to determine who would fall. Hector's lot weighed down, and he died according to fate. But this limitation on Zeus's power was not a weakness. It was a kind of wisdom. By fathering the fates and then submitting to their decrees, Zeus had created a limiting factor on his own authority. The Titans had been characterized by their rejection of limits, by raw power exercised without constraint. Cronus had tried to prevent fate through violence, swallowing his children to avoid the prophecy that one would overthrow him. Zeus chose a different path. He accepted that there were boundaries even gods must respect, that absolute power could not mean power over everything. This acceptance of limits was what made Zeus's rule sustainable where his fathers had not been. It established a cosmic order that was not dependent on one being's whims, but was structured by laws that applied universally. Zeus appeared as the guider of destiny, giving everyone their right portion, but he himself was also subject to destiny's decrees. In another sense, Zeus was sometimes described as the leader of the fates, suggesting that while he could not change their fundamental determinations, he had some role in administering them. He dispensed justice based on what people deserved, delivering the fate appropriate to their actions. This subtle distinction meant Zeus was both subject to fate and its administrator. He could not save someone from a death that had been fated, but he could ensure that the manner and timing of that death reflected their deeds. W's gave kings the right to dispense justice in the mortal world. This was a crucial aspect of his role. He was not merely a distant power, but the source of legitimate authority for human rulers. A king who judged wisely and fairly was understood to be exercising authority granted by Zeus. A tyrant who ruled through fear and violence, who ignored justice in favor of personal gain, was violating the divine order Zeus had established. This connection between divine and human governance provided theological justification for political structures in ancient Greece. Democracy itself gained legitimacy through appeals to Zeus's justice. The civic ethical norms that governed Greek city-states were traced back to Zeus's cosmic order. Law was understood to be just only if it harmonized with Themis, that divine principle of natural order and right custom that Themis embodied and that Zeus upheld. According to everything good and bad came from Zeus, he assigned the good or evil lot to mortals according to his own choice. This might seem like arbitrary power, but it was tempered by Zeus's role as guarantor of justice. He watched over human affairs with a host of divine watchers and spirits, learning of all transgressions and ensuring that justice was done. The Dike personified justice, daughter of Themis and therefore Zeus's granddaughter, served as protector of rights and courts, the arbiter who ensured that honor was maintained and wrongs were punished. She. Have you ever thought about how strange it is that the god who committed so many injustices in his personal life became the guarantor of justice itself? Zeus, who deceived lovers and pursued unwilling women, who betrayed his wife repeatedly, who sometimes acted from jealousy or wounded pride. This same being was the ultimate authority on right and wrong. Perhaps the ancient Greeks understood something profound here, that power and virtue don't necessarily coincide, that those who judge and rule are not always moral exemplars themselves, that justice as a system can exist even when administered by flawed beings. Zeus's governance extended beyond simple reward and punishment. He was also invested in the ongoing creation and vitality of the world. His countless affairs and the children they produced were not merely personal indulgences, but acts of cosmic generosity, spreading his divine gifts throughout existence, planting seeds that would grow into heroes and minor deities who enriched the mythological landscape. The results were mixed, certainly, ranging from great heroes to troubled figures to outright villains. But the diversity itself was valuable, creating a rich tapestry of stories and possibilities. Zeus's eternal rule was characterized by balance. He had to balance his own power against the autonomy of other gods, each of whom had their own domains and prerogatives. He had to balance justice with mercy, punishment with forgiveness, order with the necessity for change and disruption. He had to balance his role as father to gods, to heroes, to entire peoples who claimed descent from him, with his role as king, who must sometimes judge and punish even his own children. The assemblies of gods on Mount Olympus became the mechanism through which this balance was maintained. Themis would summon the gods at Zeus's command, and they would gather to debate matters of cosmic importance. Zeus would listen to different perspectives, would consider the interests of various deities, would make decisions that tried to account for multiple concerns. He was willing to lose a battle to win a war, to make strategic concessions that served larger purposes. This was far-seeing wisdom in action. Zeus understood that maintaining order required more than raw power. It required alliances, respect for others' authority within their domains, and the creation of systems that could function without constant divine intervention. The world Zeus created was one where the Olympians had to respect each other's realms and powers, where they had to balance their different interests rather than simply overwhelming opposition through force. Immortals experienced Zeus's rule in their daily lives. They swore oaths in his name, knowing that breaking such oaths would invite his wrath. They extended hospitality to strangers in part because Zeus, Xenios, Zeus, the protector of guests, watched over such interactions. They sought his favor through sacrifices and festivals, building temples that became architectural marvels and cultural centers. The Olympic Games, held every 4 years at Olympia, honored Zeus as king of gods while celebrating human athletic excellence. Kings and leaders invoked Zeus's authority to justify their rule. Laws were understood to derive their legitimacy from their accordance with divine justice. Courts operated under the understanding that Zeus and his daughter Dike watched over legal proceedings, that justice was not merely human convention, but cosmic principle. Yet Zeus's relationship with humanity was never simple. He cared for mortals, watched over their affairs, established justice for their benefit. But he was also capable of tremendous cruelty toward them, destroying entire cities, cursing individuals and their descendants, transforming humans into animals or objects as punishment. The Trojan War, caused in part by the divine politics of Olympus, killed countless mortals, while the gods watched and occasionally intervened on behalf of their favorites. This ambivalence reflected the Greek understanding that the gods were powerful but not perfectly benevolent, that they had their own interests and agendas that did not always align with human welfare. Zeus was king of gods and men, but his kingship over mortals was not the same as a human king's relationship with his subjects. Mortals were more like beloved pets or interesting projects than true equals. Still, Zeus established protections for mortals that his predecessors had never bothered with. He created laws that gods were expected to follow in their interactions with humans. He punished gods who abused mortals without cause. He set boundaries on divine interference in human affairs, even if those boundaries were sometimes honored more in the breach than the observance. As the eternal ruler, Zeus occupied a unique position in the cosmos. He had broken the cycle of sons overthrowing fathers, or at least paused it indefinitely. The prophecy about Metis' son overthrowing him had been circumvented by swallowing her. No serious challenge to his authority had succeeded since Typhon's defeat. The Olympian order Zeus established proved more durable than the Titan reign that preceded it. The cosmos Zeus governed was richer and more complex than what had existed before. The arts flourished under the Muses' inspiration. Heroes undertook great labors and adventures. Cities rose and fell according to divine favor and human choices. The seasons turned in their appointed order. Justice, however imperfectly, was available to those who sought it. From his throne on Olympus, Zeus watched it all. The far-seeing god whose gaze extended across the entire cosmos, who could perceive truth and character, who balanced power with law and force with wisdom. He was not a perfect ruler, his personal failings were legendary, but he was an effective one, maintaining an order that, for all its flaws, provided structure and meaning to existence. The thunderbolt remained always at hand, that weapon forged by the Cyclopes in the depths of Tartarus, ready to strike down any who threatened cosmic order. But Zeus's true power lay not in that weapon alone, but in the system he had created, the distribution of domains among gods, the establishment of law as a governing principle, the acceptance of limits even on divine authority, the balance between order and change. The hidden child in the Cretan cave had traveled an impossible distance. From that sacred darkness where the nymphs fed him milk and honey, where the curettes danced to hide his cries, where Amalthea nursed him and kept him safe, from there to the throne of the cosmos itself. He had freed his siblings from their father's belly, had waged a 10-year war against the Titans, had defeated giants and monsters, had established a new divine order and defended it against all challenges. And now he ruled, eternal and far-seeing, the king of gods and men. His story, from prophecy to birth to hidden childhood to revolution to kingship, became the foundational narrative of Greek mythology. Every other myth connected to it somehow. Every hero claimed lineage from his unions, every principle of justice traced back to his decrees. Zeus's eternal rule was not static, but dynamic. New challenges would arise, new stories would be told, new offspring would be born to shape the mythological landscape. But the fundamental order remained: sky, sea, and underworld divided among three brothers, domains distributed among the gods, law and fate governing all, and Zeus himself watching from Olympus, thunderbolt in hand, far-seeing and eternal. In the end, perhaps that's what Zeus's story tells us most powerfully. That order can emerge from chaos, that revolution can lead to stability, that power exercised with wisdom, however imperfect, can create something that endures. The infant who should have been devoured became the king who could not be overthrown. The prophecy that Cronus feared came true, but its fulfillment created not another tyrant, but a more complex ruler, one who understood that eternal authority requires more than mere force. The cosmos settled into its rhythm under Zeus's watchful eye. The storms he commanded brought both destruction and life-giving rain. The justice he administered was imperfect but real. The balance he maintained between gods, between mortals and immortals, between law and freedom held. And if sometimes the thunder rolled across the sky in the night, if lightning split the darkness with sudden brilliant light, mortals knew that Zeus was there, watching from his throne. The king of gods, the upholder of justice, the far-seeing ruler whose story had begun in a hidden cave and now encompassed all existence. The journey was complete, but the reign was eternal. From the moment Rhea handed Cronus a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes to this present age and into all time beyond, Zeus ruled. The cosmos had found its king, and that king had found his throne. May your own dreams carry you through the night as safely as the nymphs carried the infant Zeus through his hidden childhood. May you find, in your own journey, the same transformation from vulnerability to strength, from fear to authority, from chaos to order that Zeus's story embodies. And may you rest now, knowing that somewhere in the stories we tell ourselves, in the myths that shape our understanding, there is always the possibility of rising from hidden beginnings to claim the life you were meant to live. Sleep well, dreamers. The story of Zeus is complete, but your own story continues. Zone.